Good afternoon. So one of the decisions that consultant surgeons have to make during their working lives, and on average a consultant surgeon these days will work for about 30 years. They're appointed in their mid to late 30s and they'll work to their mid to late 60s. One of the decisions that they need to make during that time is whether or not to adopt new procedures and to use new devices as those things come along, or to stay using their standard tried and tested operations and devices that they used during their training. Now, there are things that influence that decision, and one of them is the surgeon's personality themselves. So there are surgeons who really are truly innovators. They're creative, they're full of new ideas. We're going to hear from Gianni Angelini this evening. He's one of those. And then there are early adopters and late adopters. I think I'd classify myself as a late adopter. And then there's something called a surgical laggard. A laggard. Now, what's that? Well, of course, that's somebody who adopts a new procedure very late in the day. And the problem with the word laggard is it's onomatopoeic, isn't it? So it definitely makes you think that that surgeon adopts the new procedure very late in the day. That's true. But somehow that's bad for patients. Somehow it's preventing them having a new operation, a new device. And the problem with that, and this is really important, is that the implicit assumption is that new is better. And that's the problem. Is new always better? And so surgeons are faced with those decisions. They have to decide, should they take up those new procedures and use those new devices? How do they tell whether it's safe, whether it's as good as the standard treatment that they've always used? Maybe it's even better. And the problem is that in surgery, new operations, new devices, new procedures can all be introduced without thorough, careful, and scientific evaluation. It's completely different to the way that drugs, new pharmaceutical products are introduced. Something that needs to change. So what influences surgeons to make those decisions? Well, here goes. So 3 or 4 things, I think. One is they're influenced by other surgeons, personalities. So conferences, typically. We go to a surgical conference. I was at one last week. We heard famous, eminent professors talking about their new operation. And what you should remember is that after surgeons have been at conferences, they will then try out those new procedures. So should you be having an elective surgical procedure, it's well worth you asking that surgeon, have you been to a conference recently? I'm not joking, this is true. So I don't think you should change your practice simply on hearing a talk. You should inquire about it more. Secondly, and this is also a little bit worrying, is that device manufacturers will pitch up in the coffee room in the operating theatre, and they'll say to you, there's some new staplers we would like you to try these out today and give us some feedback. In fact, they'd said to me a few times, we're doing a trial on these new staplers. And I go, what? A trial? They've no idea what that means. And they are providing those staplers, usually free, to the hospital, and they want a little bit of feedback. Now, that may or may not be dangerous, but what's the biggest problem with that is that when they don't work and when they go wrong, the outcomes are not going to be then reported. They won't become generally available so other people can learn from that. So I think introducing new devices that way, once they're just CE marked, is also not ideal. And then there's the issue, which is really quite easy to look at, and that's the issue of surgeons reading the published literature about innovation. And of course, the literature can be looked at and it can be properly evaluated. And so one of the things we're doing in the surgical innovation theme in the Bristol BRC, which we're pleased to be part of, is that we're teaching surgical trainees and medical students, in fact, how to really evaluate the scientific literature about innovation. A lot of it's very poor, and in the future we'll sort out how to report it. But we're teaching them that so that when they are consultants, they will be equipped to make those decisions wisely for the benefit of patients, to protect surgeons and to protect healthcare providers so that we invest in our health service properly. We have two academic clinical lecturers, Natalie Blenko and Barry Main, who are leading a group of surgical trainees, dental students, medical students to do these projects. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Barry Main now, who will talk to you more about it.
Thank you, Jane. I think few people in this room will be unaware of the recent and ongoing scandal regarding the vaginal mesh implant. Now, many thousands of women around the world have been subject to physical harm, are in chronic pain, and suffered psychological harm because this device, which was originally designed and approved for one clinical indication, was thought to be useful for a second clinical indication, but without thorough, robust, and transparent evaluation of its use for that new clinical indication. Now, as Jane has just said, myself, Natalie, and Jane are leading this project. And what we're going to do is look at the reporting of novel invasive procedures and devices in the scientific literature, all the way through from the very early reports from IDEA, through preclinical studies, and on to clinical studies and randomized trial if there are any. Now, our hypothesis is that many of these devices and procedures have not been, some of which, like the vaginal mesh, are in routine daily practice, have not been subject to the same standards of evaluation that the medical profession, funders, the NHS and patients would expect if we were introducing a new drug. Now, a secondary aim of this project is to offer research training opportunities to undergraduate students and trainee surgeons. And we have partnered with the INSPIRE program, which is offered by the Academy of Medical Sciences. And last summer, we had 3 undergraduates, a couple of medical students and a dental student, who came and worked with us for a whole month in the summer. They're paid to do so, and they embarked on some of the review work that we're presenting today. And we've also been joined by postgraduate doctors from year 1 postgraduate all the way through to very most senior surgical trainees who are working with us on reviews in areas of interest to them. And for those that come along and work with us, we provided training in literature searching, in abstract screening and data extraction. They're also going to learn how to write their papers as part of a collaborative group, and they'll present their own work at conferences. But most importantly, we hope that they gain those lifelong skills in critical appraisal that will inform their work as consultants in the future, their interactions with colleagues, and most importantly, their interactions with their patients. So we have recently published the methods for our reviews, and I'm pleased to say that 2 of our INSPIRE students, Alex and Phil, co-authored that paper with us. And although the methods were originally developed for studies of, this is a robotically assisted resection of a tumour at the back of the mouth, we've adapted those methods and we're now studying different types of robotic surgery. We're looking at a novel device for the treatment of reflux disease and a novel vascular surgical procedure, amongst other things. And the really exciting thing is that the momentum is here now. The word has got out. Every other week, Natalie and I are approached by a surgical trainee who's heard about this project, wants to get involved. And at last count, we have 14 of these reviews underway or about to start. In addition to the individual reviews, we're also planning some cross-cutting overviews of reviews. So to illustrate what we're trying to do, I'm going to present some of the early findings from one of these reviews, which is looking at a novel type of heart pacemaker. Now, whilst I am the person standing here delivering this talk, the hard work has really been done by Matthew Edmondson here and his colleague Rachel Morley. These are our 2 academic F2 doctors. So these are year 2 postgraduate doctors who have spent 4 months of this year working with us in the centre. Matt is going to be a cardiologist, Rachel is going to be a vascular surgeon, and already they are equipped with these skills in critical appraisal that will inform their work in the future. A bit of clinical background on the understanding I operate on the head and neck. I'm not a cardiologist, but pacemakers look like this. There's a battery pack which sits under the skin, just under the left collarbone. And these wires, also called leads, are fed through a large vein and sit in the heart. Now, these pacemakers have been around for about 5 decades and have been very effective at doing what they're meant to do, which is to keep the heart beating. But there are well-recognized late complications, and these are namely blockage of that large vein and infection. And those complications are mostly attributed to the wire leads. So that finding led to the development of this new generation of pacemaker devices, the so-called leadless pacemakers. So these tiny devices, there are 2 main ones around, are introduced into the heart through a vein in the groin, and then they're docked into the heart muscle with a little docking device, a little bit like a spaceship docking onto the moon, okay? And it is these devices that have been the focus of Matthew's review. At this stage, it's probably worth just spending a couple of seconds thinking about the regulation of medical devices. If I'm a manufacturer and I have produced some new medical devices, before I can market that device, I need to get it approved. In the United States, that approval process is governed by the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration. And in Europe, the approval process culminates in the awarding of a CE mark. That's the same whether it's a leadless pacemaker, a children's toy, or a frying pan. Okay? Now, in America, it's really interesting, the process is pretty transparent. You can, with a bit of work, find all of the correspondence, the emails, the letters, the reports that the FDA produce as part of this approval process. And in Europe, it's far more opaque. It's nigh on impossible. We have tried very hard to find the equivalent documentation for these pacemakers, and we can't. Part of the reason is that it's mediated through a group of private companies. So it's very opaque and the process is just not transparent. So our review aims to review the published literature and then for a given device, and then to map the reporting and its evolution through the literature onto these regulatory time points. So, for example, we're going to look at patient selection and questions like, are consecutive patients recruited into these trials? And then when they are being recruited, what are they told about the innovative nature of that device or procedure? From the pacemaker trials, I can tell you that they are not recruiting consecutive patients into these trials, but neither are they saying why not and what has happened to those patients who were not offered the device. There's also a paucity of reporting of issues around informed consent and governance. We're very interested in looking at the reporting of operator and center expertise and issues around learning curve. When is it stabilized and ready to be used in the wider population? Again, these issues are very poorly reported in the papers reviewed across all our devices so far. Excuse me. And we don't know, therefore, if the leadless pacemakers only really work when they're placed by a handful of very experienced experts, or whether other interventional cardiologists would be able to make these things work. And a large part of our work is looking at the reporting of outcomes, both good and bad, and how those are reflected and acted upon as the reporting of the device evolves through the literature. And what we are picking up at this stage is a lot of heterogeneity in the definition, the selection, and reporting of outcomes, say between a trial looking at one of these leadless pacemakers and a trial looking at others. They will define endpoints in very different ways. Now, this timeline that Matt has put together illustrates some of these findings so far. The horizontal blue bars represent large industry-funded trials. The vertical line towards the 2013 end is the point at which this particular leadless pacemaker received its CE marking, and you will note that this device is yet to be FDA approved. What is interesting is that on the top, the white box towards the left, is the first time that you could have gone onto PubMed and found a paper out about this device 15 or 18 months after it was CE approved for marketing. The red lines across the bars represent stoppage of the clinical trials due to major adverse events. The stoppages in 2014 and 2015 were due to the finding of a higher incidence than expected of fluid around the heart in patients who'd been fitted with this device. The most recent stoppage reported in October 2016 was the finding that the battery was failing in some of these pacemakers. Now, if the battery fails in a device that's meant to keep your heart beating, if it stops, the heart could stop beating. 1,400 people have been fitted with this device, but it's only now, almost 5 years after CE marking, that we're finding these things out. So we argue that there is a need for a structured, robust, transparent, and stepwise approach to the evaluation of new surgical devices. The NIHR, which is a government agency which oversees regulation in this country, have been alerted to these findings, and they've come up with this document specifically about these leadless pacemakers, in which they outline a series of endpoints or outcomes that they say should be reported. We in the BRC Surgical Innovations team think we should go further, and that there should be a core outcome set that should be reported for every single new surgical device trialed on a human being. And a major part of the work of our theme is going to be developing such core outcome sets. Whilst I am here, allow me to plug the fact that we are hosting the IDEAL International Conference just across the water at the MShed in September this year. The IDEAL framework was developed around 10 years ago, and it aimed to do just that, provide a stepwise framework for the development of surgical innovation and devices. It's fair to say, I think, thus far that the uptake hasn't been great, either by innovators, nor has it been endorsed by journals. And we're hoping that the work we do in the BRC Surgical Innovations theme will help sort of inform the further development of the IDEAL framework to increase that uptake and make the process more transparent and more robust. So to finish off, I've told you about multiple reviews that we've got going on looking at different innovations, both device and procedures, and also that we're training a new generation of surgical innovators and hopefully some surgical academics in key skills of critical appraisal. And across the BRC Surgical Innovations theme as a whole, we're working to develop methods to better evaluate and report the development of surgical innovation. Thank you very much.